Alabama football, Nick Saban, the standard of college football, the dynasty that brought in 6 national championships in an 11-year span. But at some point, it all came crashing down, and now the Crimson Tide are coming off a 38-3 romping to Indiana in the Rose Bowl game. Today, we will look back at the exact moments the cracks formed in the armor in Tuscaloosa. So coming off the 2020 season, the Dynasty was in full force, not only an 11-0 regular season versus an all-SEC schedule, but a dominant college football playoff run would give Saban championship number 7 as they picked apart the Ohio State defense in Miami Gardens, Florida. So of course, in 2021 the train kept rolling, right? Well, not so fast, because now Mac Jones was in the NFL, Devontae Smith was in the NFL, Jalen Waddle was in the NFL, and Patrick Surtain was in the NFL. It'd be a new look Alabama from mostly top to bottom. But if you're going to replace Mac Jones, Bryce Young is the guy you want at quarterback. The 5-star prospect out of modern-day high school would time and time again prove to be one of the best quarterbacks Saban has ever had, even becoming the first Alabama quarterback to win the Heisman Trophy. So what went wrong in 2021? Well, the regular season for the most part was smooth sailing, many dominant performances, but there was a hiccup, and that came in Cal Field. The energy was different in College Station from the very first drive. Remember, this was the lone game that CBS chose for their primetime SEC on CBS night window of the year. That's how big this was, and the energy was shown by Texas A&M quarterback Zach Calzada, who got some massive pass completions to get the Aggies a field goal on their first drive. Yes, this might have been unranked 3-2 versus 5-0 and number 1 in the country, but Jimbo Fisher versus Nick Saban was the budding rivalry in college football. So of course, on the following Alabama drive, Bryce Young would show his greatness going right down the field for his 18th touchdown pass of the year. But on the offensive side, the Aggies had found something that worked, and unlike the first drive, this time they capped it off with a touchdown. We were now in for a shootout, but a shootout that would lean towards Texas A&M as they'd force a fumble at midfield and recover their first fumble of the year. And this time it would be A-Chain and Spiller on the ground who'd get Texas A&M to the 6-yard line where it'd open up the passing game for Calzada to take a 17-7 lead to end the first. Now Alabama, who was trailing like this on the road for the first time all year, would need to lock in with a poised second quarter performance. Unfortunately for them, the exact opposite happened. Facing 3rd and goal, Bryce Young from the pocket would throw an ill-advised interception with 3 points in his back pocket. But then Calzada would give it right back to the Tide and gave the number 1 team in the country life. Brian Robinson then stormed into the red zone, but the Aggie defense would force a made 38-yard field goal to get the score back within 7. And now Calzada had to answer with a flawless drive leading to an Isaiah Spiller 15-yard rush touchdown. The score was now 24-10 coming out of half, and with all the momentum, the one mistake A&M couldn't let happen happened. Not only a blocked punt, but a blocked punt returned for a touchdown, putting points on the board for a struggling offense. All of a sudden, it's 24-17, but when your special teams makes a devastating play, there's only one way to respond, and Devon A-Chain returned the ensuing kickoff all the way back for 6. The Aggies now took hold of a 31-17 lead, and Bryce Young would need to work his magic if their undefeated season would stay alive. First, the drive started with Brian Robinson, then Bryce Young and Jamison Williams would connect on 2 massive pass plays that result in a very quick score for 6. Alabama was going to keep fighting, and A&M knew that they were the underdogs, had no chance at winning, and maybe that'd kick in when Bama got the stop and would chip off another field goal, getting the deficit to just 4 in this 4th quarter. And now with the ball once again, Alabama had the chance to take the lead. And when it seemed that's 100% what we were on our way to, the Texas A&M defense stood strong once again, forcing a field goal. Could this now struggling A&M offense muster up anything to protect their 31-30 lead midway through this 4th? No, they could not. And now all Bryce Young needed was a field goal to take the lead. But why go for a field goal? First he went over the middle to JoJo Earle, then to the outside to Jamison Williams, then on the slant right back to Williams, and with the Young to Williams show in full force, Young would go right back to him in the end zone, wide open. In Alabama, Nick Saban, the Crimson Tide, you've done it again. And now feeling every bit of momentum on your side, why not go for 2 and go right back to Jamison Williams? Because you're just simply invincible. You're the reigning national champion. These aren't the games you lose, and they might have started slow, but the defense was now smothering A&M, and their offense was scorching hot with a now 38-31 lead. Just 5 minutes remained, and was tonight just going to be a we fought hard or we dug down deep and we found a way? Well, Calzada was certainly finding a way on this drive. Massive throws, and with 3 minutes to go, the fade was perfectly placed in the arms of Smith to tie this game at 38. And oh, did Calzada pay the price. And now their defense will repay them by forcing a 3-and-out, and here we go. Calzada with the 2-minute drill to potentially hand Alabama their first loss of the decade. He might be shaken up, but he gave this drive everything he had, and with 14 seconds to go, a crucial pass interference would set the Aggies up with pristine field position to kick the game-winning chip shot. And as time expired, the kick was up and in. Stunningly, Texas A&M had ended Alabama's undefeated streak, handing them their first loss of the decade, the final score being 41-38 in an unforgettable thriller. And that made Alabama's SEC championship appearance a must-win to make the playoffs. And that SEC championship would come against Georgia, a team that Alabama had notoriously had a mental chokehold over. But before the date in Atlanta, Alabama would walk into Jordan-Hare, and we all know what happens in that stadium in this rivalry, and guess what? They need the heroics of Bryce Young once again. This game was completely marked by the defenses early on. The score was 0-0 through 1, and then midway through the second, on a punt return, the game would change as Jamison Williams would get ejected for a targeting penalty. So Bryce Young was now down his wide receiver 1, and Auburn would get their best field position of the day. TJ Finley would then launch a prayer to Demetrius Robinson, and then on a screen from the 15, Kobe Hudson would take it the distance. Alabama would finish the second quarter still with 0 points on the board, and would now suffer their first scoreless half in an Iron Bowl since 2000 when they lost 9-0. So would the third quarter be any better? Not at all. And after a poor punt following the half's opening drive, Auburn would be set up for a field goal to make it 10-0. And instead of starting their comeback, Bryce was picked off at midfield. But the Alabama defense was still stifling. Remember, Auburn's only points came off short fields, and they roughed up Finley pretty good on this stop. Now sensing the desperation on the sideline and their season on the line, the offense finally found something. But signature Alabama was always going to lead to yet another special teams error on a failed field goal attempt and 0 points on the board. Now we're in the fourth quarter, and the score remains at 10-0 with Alabama possessing the ball. And again, when they finally looked like they would get points on the board, fourth down would kill the Alabama drive once again, as a bad snap would result in heavy pressure up the middle and Bryce Young was dropped. But guess what? The defense had their back again. Finley hadn't made any mistakes so far, but Josh Job's interception would get the Tide right back in it on a high pass. And what we hadn't seen all day, Brian Robinson had a massive rush to the red zone, but the Auburn defense said what about us and sacked Bryce Young on 3rd and goal, forcing a field goal. Auburn still held on to a 10-3 lead, and a field goal would probably put this one away. But a field goal would not take place as Finley would make mistake number 2, giving the ball back to Alabama. Until roughing the passer was called, and the interception was erased. And look at that, the cracks in the armor in Tuscaloosa, just slightly starting to form one by one. The Bama standard, this certainly wasn't the pinnacle of it, and one by one, you'll just notice things start to shift. Thankfully for them, the defense was still putting up a daunting performance, and with over 4 minutes to go, another chance for Bryce Young, and that chance would end like most of the drives did on this day, a failed fourth down. And this looked to be the uppercut delivered right before the knockout punch. Exactly 2 minutes remained, Auburn led by 7 and started the drive at the Alabama 46. They just needed to land one last shot. Bigsby's first down would go for negative yardage. Bigsby's second down run would then go for 10 yards, but he ran out of bounds, saving Alabama's last timeout. And now on 3rd and 1, immediately stuffed behind the line of scrimmage. They had no choice but to punt, and well, it was the perfect punt. You couldn't deliver the knockout punch on offense, but you've stunned them. The ball laid at the 97-yard line, and for an offense that's been struggling since the opening tick, a quarterback now missing his wide receiver 1, and essentially the season on the line, Bryce Young had no choice. If Alabama was headed to Atlanta with a shot at the playoff, he had to have his Heisman moment right here, no questions asked. The drive almost started with a disaster, but Bama stayed alive. Then on 2nd down, just nothing open. This was the worst Bryce had looked all year, and he now only had 2 throws left to save the season. Young would then work the pocket and use his 6th sense to find John Mechie for 22. Then on the next play, he'd take off for 9 yards. A minute and 6 remained, and Bryce Young would loft a beautiful pass for 21 to Ja'Cory Brooks. Now under a minute, Bryce would just scramble around and try to find something. He clearly had to poise now, and he needed one big shot to send this game to overtime. So 3rd and 7, 48 seconds to go, Auburn would call a timeout. A useful timeout as they were immediately pressuring Bryce Young and forced an incompletion in 4th down. The drive had started at the 3. They had now scratched and clawed to the Auburn 42-yard line, but they now faced 4th and 7, so one play would decide their fate. And this was a down that had given them fits all night. But when you have to have it, you dig down deep, and Jaleel Billingsley would find his way to the ball and get out of bounds to keep the drive alive. Now with 4 more downs to play with, they faltered on 2 of them. Now it's 3rd down again, and it's time to load up your best shot. Bryce Young, on 3rd and 10 with 29 seconds left, would stand tall in the pocket and launch it to the corner of the end zone to Ja'Cory Brooks, and he hauled it in and silenced all of Jordan Hare. Nick Saban, you madman, you've almost done it again. Overtime would see Young and the Tide strike first in the end zone, and Auburn's offense said I'm joining the party too, and they answered to make it 17-17 in overtime. The stakes were high, you could feel the tension, and even though it was the offenses in the first overtime, the defenses showed up in the second. And 2 field goals later, it was tied at 20 going to a 3rd overtime where you were forced to go for 2. Bryce Young delivered again, and now Finley had to answer, and that he did, on a play that somehow riled up nostalgic feelings of Lutzenkirchen in this game. So now in a 4th overtime, we sat tied at 22, and Auburn was right back on the field, and this time their 2-point conversion would fall unsuccessful. And guess what? Bryce Young and the Tide were just 2 yards away from heading to Atlanta with everything to play for. And that's when John Mechie would zig his way free of the defense and Young hit him wide open. And Alabama would hit the Crimson Crane all the way to Atlanta. And somehow, someway, the quest for 7 under Saban stays alive. And they did it in a stadium that has haunted them for over a decade, and the date with the Dogs was set. Alabama once again had their backs against the wall. They had to win to make the playoff. And with everything on the line, of course, Bryce Young would have a flawless showing in a 41-24 win to advance to 12-1 and head to the college football playoff as the #1 seed, taking the spot that Georgia once held entering Mercedes-Benz. That would set up a date with Cincinnati in the Cotton Bowl, and this would be a pretty forgettable 27-6 win for the Tide to advance to the national title, and their opponent would be who else other than Georgia. The Dogs were vengeful and coming off a 34-11 win versus Michigan in their semifinal in the Orange Bowl. And not only does the SEC Championship sting, but also the 2018 SEC Championship, where Hurts led his cinematic comeback, where it was on the heels of the 2018 College Football Playoff National Championship game, where it was Tua who led the comeback on that heartbreaking night in Atlanta, Georgia. So finally the time would come, and maybe it was injuries, and maybe it wasn't. In the SEC title, John Mechie tore his ACL, and then in the national title versus Georgia, Jamison Williams would tear his ACL. So Bryce Young was down wide receiver 1 and 2, going up against what was clearly the best defense in the country, and the Heisman Trophy winner put up a valiant effort. To start the game, Bama marched right down the field before the Georgia defense stiffened up right at the 20-yard line, and the Tide got on the board first with 3. The rest of the first quarter was then a defensive affair until Bennett aired it out to George Pickens, but just like the first Crimson Tide drive, this Georgia drive would also end with a red zone field goal. And then on the next drive, disaster would strike. Bryce Young lofted one to Jamison Williams, who spun around to make the catch, and in the process, he'd fall victim to a torn ACL, and his night was done on the biggest stage. This now left Bryce without his 2 top targets while going up against a vaunted Georgia defense. The drive would be capped off with a Will Reichert field goal, and the Tide took a 6-3 lead in a game where every single point would be hard to come by. A few drives later, Bama would have the ball again, and Cameron Latu would find himself open, and the Tide now had their biggest play of the night. Unfortunately for Latu, he wasn't able to hold on to the end zone throw, and then on 3rd down, Young would run for his life before being sacked. The score now set at 9-3 off some crucial missed opportunities. Their inability to get 6 on the board let Georgia get away with only a 6-point half and just trail by 3 going back to the locker rooms. And in the 3rd quarter, it was the Georgia defense that have to be the offense. Bryce Young would overthrow his man in double coverage, and it was picked off, setting the Dogs up handsomely just for them to have to punt. Alabama's offense at this point was just a check-down machine, just hoping to hold on till the clock hit triple zeros. Running back Brian Robinson became the primary receiver, and when they faced a 3rd and long and had to extend the field, Young's pass sailed right through the hands of the inexperienced Ajayi Hall, and the Tide were forced to kick yet another field goal in this national title game with just 18 minutes left to play. So signature Alabama. The field goal would be blocked, leaving them with no points on the board and still just a 9-6 lead. This would then lead to James Cook racing down the sideline to the 15, and just like that, Georgia was in position to strike, and they did. Georgia had delivered the game's first touchdown, and Alabama for the first time today would trail 13-9 heading into the fourth. And in this fourth quarter, the story of the day would continue. Young delivered one right into the breadbasket to Hall, just to come up short on first, second, and third and goal. The field goal would have to suffice, and the Tide still trailed, but this time it was just a 1-point deficit at 13-12. The Bama defense immediately then stepped up and got one of the more improbable interceptions we've seen in a championship game. Then finally, they found the end zone as Young hit Latu wide open, but the ensuing 2-point conversion would be unsuccessful as the dog defense was on Bryce Young from the jump. With the score now 18-13, for the second time tonight, Stetson Bennett would go deep downfield and they'd draw multiple flags for pass interference. So why not do it again? Bennett stood right at the midfield logo and launched it to Adonai Mitchell, who snatched the lead right back at 19-18 after the 2-point conversion fell unsuccessful. And then after a failed Bama drive, Georgia had the chance to salt the game away as we approached 5 minutes remaining. And they didn't use all the clock, but the drive was a massive success. Kirby drew up a screen and Bowers did the rest. And guess what? We're here again. It wouldn't be a Georgia-Alabama game with everything on the line if it didn't come down to the very final possession. And for Alabama, if they wanted to build another house, they needed to drive down the field with 3 minutes and 33 seconds remaining, down 26-18, with the worst receiving core the Tide had put on the field since Saban arrived. Either Georgia was finally going to look their demons in the eye and overcome them, or the Tide would once again find a way to get it done. Immediately facing third down, Young would go to his running back turned wide receiver 1 Brian Robinson for a massive conversion. Then under 2 minutes, he'd move around before finding Latu, and the Tide were moving into Georgia territory. Then Young would decide to go for it all, but the inexperienced Brooks only put one hand out for the ball and it fell incomplete. This led us to 3rd and 10, and on a desperate throw, it'd be picked off by Keely Ringo, who would take it all the way back for a pick 6. And finally, Georgia had overcome Alabama. And the valiant effort by the Heisman Trophy winner would come up short, and Alabama would be looking at a daunting retool to this roster. Many think this national championship loss was the moment you could truly see the dynasty starting to crack, and things would never be more evident than week 2 of 2022 versus Texas, because now Evan Neal was gone, John Mechie was gone, Jamison Williams was gone, and the Tide were shaken in Austin, Texas. Quinn Ewers was lighting the Tide up, and it looked like the Texas quarterback was on pace for a massive day, but then Dallas Turner drove him into the turf and knocked him out the game. And what followed was a defensive struggle. The Tide trailed 19-17 with 2 minutes to go in the fourth quarter, and that's when Bryce Young's greatness would come on display as he somehow evaded the Texas blitz to get Alabama in prime position to walk away with a 20-19 win. But a 1-point win versus an unranked Texas team missing their starting quarterback was not the way you wanted to start the year. And once we got into SEC play, the Bama defense would wear down, and all of a sudden, Alabama was engaged in a shootout versus Tennessee in one of the greatest college football games we've ever seen. The Heisman contender Hendon Hooker would connect with Jalen Hyatt for 5 total touchdowns and 207 yards on just 6 receptions, a type of performance that seemed unfathomable versus an Alabama defense just a few years ago. Alabama first fell behind 7-0, then tied it up at 7-all, just for the Hyatt explosion to notch his first and second touchdown on the board to take a 21-7 lead. Alabama then answered with a field goal, which just wasn't enough versus Tennessee offense, who responded right back with a 4th touchdown in just 16 minutes. Alabama was able to chip off 10 points the rest of the half, and after a putrid start, only trailed 28-20 at halftime. So in this second half, it was an outright shootout. Alabama struck first with Jahmyr Gibbs running for 26 yards, and Bryce Young delivered on the 2-point conversion to somehow tie this game at 28-all. So when in doubt, dial up Jalen Hyatt, who outran the defense for a 60-yard strike for 6. And just as the trend goes, Alabama answered right back to take a 35-34 lead. One team had to break, but when would it happen? Well, Helms would pick off Hendon Hooker, and Alabama couldn't answer. So crisis averted. And guess who's going to go 78 yards for yet another touchdown? Jalen Hyatt. and they even got the 2-point conversion to retake a 7-point lead at 42-35. With the way this game was going, you knew Bryce Young would answer, and after a beautiful drive, they risked it all and went for it on 4th and goal and converted to tie the game up at 42. And just when it looked like Tennessee was poised to answer, the quarterback-running back handoff was fumbled and Dallas Turner picked it up for a walk-in touchdown. And just like that, the Tide led 49-42 and Tennessee had 6 minutes to answer, which they did exactly that. Even though it came off a controversial pass interference call that without it certainly would have won Alabama the game. But that's all in the past, and Jalen Hyatt would catch his staggering 5th touchdown. And with under 2 minutes to go, Bryce Young got the ball in a 49-49 game with the chance to land the knockout punch. But in deep field goal range, just like the national championship last year, drop problems and poor O-line protection would do the Tide in. Now forced to attempt a 50-yard field goal to take a 52-49 win, you know exactly what's going to happen. Signature Alabama, wide right. And with just 19 seconds left, Hendon Hooker had the 2 best throws of his career to set up a 40-yard field goal that would win the game. And finally, Tennessee had beaten Alabama after 15 long and grueling years. As more time goes on, you can see this clearly isn't the Alabama of old. Yes, they'd always struggle with field goal kicking, but the stout defense, dominant offensive lines, best receiver corps in the SEC, and best running back in the SEC just wasn't the standard anymore. And maybe it's the introduction of the transfer portal, but never before had the Tide been this thin. The Texas game was strike 1, the other UT was strike 2, and now strike 3 would come in Death Valley at night. The Alabama Crimson Tide fighting for their playoff lives, and the LSU Tigers welcoming them, led by one of the best offenses in the country. On that night, another shootout would ensue. The first quarter was scoreless, including a costly pick by the Heisman Trophy winner, who was just trying to do a little too much. LSU would then draw first blood, taking a 7-0 lead, and Jace McClellan would take the slant all the way inside the 15-yard line, but the LSU defense again made Young's life a living nightmare. With the score 7-3, Alabama would scratch and claw to get a field goal on the board, making the score 7-6 at half. It's in the third quarter where things would pick up. Both teams put touchdowns on the board, and it was 15-14 early in the fourth. And then with just under 7 minutes to go, LSU would retake the lead on a field goal at 17-15. And Bryce Young then locked in with another one of those Heisman-like plays to find Ja'Cory Brooks on an improbable 41-yard touchdown. The 2-point conversion would fall incomplete, and LSU now trailed just 21-17 with Jaden Daniels needing a touchdown. And he used his legs to scorch the Bama defense, then lofted one to the freshman Mason Taylor to retake the lead at 24-21. Back and forth we go, and now it was Bryce's turn to tie or take the lead. His 2-minute drill would see throw after throw, and they reached the range for a 46-yard field goal. We know what happens to Alabama in these gotta-have-it field goal situations, but this one, unlike the kick in Tennessee, had just enough to clear the crossbar and send this game to overtime. And in the first overtime, Alabama struck first for 6 plus the extra point. So now in a 31-24 ball game, LSU had to answer. In the 2010s, it was the Alabama defense who dominated this rivalry in 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. Now the tide was starting to shift, but maybe one last time, the Alabama defense of old could show up and do what they've done in Death Valley so many times, except the cracks were just too evident by this point, because in just one single play, Jaden Daniels ran right through the Alabama defense and into the end zone. And with all the momentum in the world, LSU would go for 2, roll out right, and Daniels found Mason Taylor once again to stun the Crimson Tide and end their season on a 32-31 victory. A play that looked a lot like what the other Tigers who play in Death Valley had done to them half a decade before. And just like that, Alabama had officially been eliminated from the college football playoff. A stunner. This was the earliest Alabama had suffered a second loss since the 2010 season. They'd closed the season in winning their last 3, including a top 15 matchup over Ole Miss 30-24 and a dominant 49-27 Iron Bowl win. But once again, these showings wouldn't be enough to land in the college football playoff, and the collegiate careers of Bryce Young and Will Anderson would come to an end in a 45-20 rout over Kansas State in the Sugar Bowl. So coming off the worst Alabama season in over 12 years, The Tide would have no identity behind quarterback Jalen Milroe, and just like last year, it was a showdown between the Horns and the Tide, and this time we're in T-Town where they'd wear the same uniform combination that kick-started the Dynasty in the Rose Bowl in January of 2010. In this massive early season matchup between the number 11 and number 3 team in the country is where I'd officially say the Dynasty started to fall. Unlike last year's matchup, Quinn Ewers was healthy from start to finish. And on the side of the Crimson Tide, the Heisman Trophy winner wasn't here anymore, and that made all the difference. Mistake number 1 for the Tide was when Jalen Milroe threw a pick right in the hands of Jahdae Barron. But Texas wouldn't capitalize for 6 as Ewers' throw went right through the hands of Xavier Worthy. Now trailing just 3-0, Alabama was able to muster a field goal drive to tie it. Steve Sarkisian then drew up a deep ball and Quinn Ewers placed it with perfection right into the hands of Xavier Worthy, who beat the star true freshman safety Caleb Downs. Then the Texas defense immediately got to Milroe, and Ewers was still dialed in, moving the offense down into field goal range. Alabama now was trailing 13-3 to Texas, which just seemed unfathomable a year or two ago. Right before half, Alabama would put a field goal on the board, and the score was 13-6 going into the locker rooms. Then to start the third, Texas defense again showed their prowess in forcing another field goal. But if you look at it this way, Alabama was 3 for 3 on field goals in a big game. And their defense had finally found their groove. But when they needed Milroe the most, he just overthrew McClellan, and the Georgia transfer A.D. Mitchell got the Texas drive going with a heavily contested catch. And Texas got into field goal range before Bert Auburn would miss. So Bama, after all this, just trailed by 4 at 13-9. But again, Bama's offense was nowhere to be found, and Texas got the ball right back until they failed a 4th and 2 attempt. This had turned into a complete defensive affair, and one team's offense just had to make a play, and that play would be Milroe unleashing one to the Georgia transfer Jermaine Burton. 3 quarters had gone by, and the Alabama pass game had finally shown up, and Bama had their first lead of the day at 16-13. So when one pass game shows up, why not the other? Quinn Ewers stood in the pocket and delivered one to JT Sanders, who set him up for an easy touchdown right into the hands of A.D. Mitchell. The two teams were going back and forth, and now Bama trailed once again at 16-20, and you could cut the tension in Bryant-Denny with a knife. A 21-game home winning streak and a 57-game regular season winning streak versus non-conference opponents was both on the line. And right when Bama needed to answer, Jalen Milroe threw one right into the hands of the Longhorns, and Jonathan Brooks immediately ran it right in for a 27-16 lead. Now an offense that had looked very pedestrian would need to step up and step up fast, and well, they did just that. Amari Niblack took it 39 yards on an absolutely absurd touchdown reception, and a 2-point conversion to Isaiah Bond might be even more absurd. So now it's 27-24, and the rematch between these two iconic college football brands had turned into a classic. Quinn Ewers, sensing the momentum heading to Alabama's side, stepped up in the pocket and rifled one to Jordan Whittington. And that set up 2nd and 10, and perhaps the most important throw of his career. With just over 8 minutes to go, he stood strong in the pocket and lofted a ball right into the hands of A.D. Mitchell to take a 34-24 lead. Texas wasn't being passed the torch. In this moment, they were taking the torch, and Anthony Hill enveloped Jalen Milroe, giving the ball right back to the Texas offense. And in what Alabama used to do to opponents, Texas would now possess the ball the final 7 minutes and ran right down Alabama's throat, taking every single remaining second off the clock. And just like that, the game was over. Quinn Ewers connected on 3 massive touchdown passes on a near 350-yard day while not turning the ball over. Meanwhile, his counterpart Milroe threw just 2 touchdowns alongside his 2 interceptions on a 255-yard day. The Longhorns walked into Bryant-Denny Stadium and did for a while what many considered unfathomable. The Horns' 34-24 win in Tuscaloosa marked Nick Saban's largest margin of defeat at home in his entire Alabama tenure, dating back to 2007. It also marked the Tide's first regular season non-conference home loss since 2007, which ended a 43-game winning streak versus non-conference opponents at home, and a 57-game winning streak versus non-conference opponents in general in the regular season. And it also ended a 21-game home winning streak, marking their first home loss of the decade. Safe to say this was rarefied air, as Steve Sarkisian also became just the third Saban disciple to defeat him, making Saban 28-3 versus former assistants, which all three of the losses came in the last 3 years, with Jimbo Fisher capturing the first victory, making Saban 24-1, then Kirby Smart's national championship victory made Saban 25-2, and now Steve Sarkisian was the 3-28-3. You could clearly see Alabama's dominance slipping, but their season wasn't over just yet. There was still time to turn things around and make a run for championship number 7 under St. Nick. So, they ran the table. But this run would come after what was looking to be one of the lowest points in Alabama history, barely scathing by USF after benching Jalen Milroe and coming up with even worse quarterback play from Ty Simpson and Tyler Buckner in a 17-3 win in a game that was 3-3 midway through the third quarter. If losing to Texas wasn't a wake-up call, this certainly was. The Tide then defeated number 15 Ole Miss 24-10, number 17 Tennessee 34-20, and then number 14 LSU 42-28. So after all the hard work was done, Alabama needed to defeat a 6-win Auburn team in the Iron Bowl to set up a win and end in the SEC championship game for the playoff. And everything they worked for looked to be thrown away in just 3 short hours. Of course, in the final ever Iron Bowl on CBS, we'd see missed field goals by the Tide in a 1-score game. So now it's the fourth quarter with 42 seconds to go. The score 24-20, and the Crimson Tide needing to convert 4th and goal from the 31-yard line. And with all the incredible endings this rivalry has seen over the years, why not send off the last SEC on CBS Iron Bowl with an incredible catch in the corner of the end zone by Isaiah Bond to keep Alabama's season alive and stun Jordan Hare? Maybe Alabama was just a team of destiny. I know that sounds hilarious to say for a dynasty, but now the date was set. In Georgia's backyard, we'd once again see the Tide and Dogs go to war. But this time, even though the Dogs were the number 1 team in the country, if they lost, they were out of the playoff. And for Alabama, the roles were reversed for maybe the first time ever, as it was the Georgia Bulldogs seen as the odds-on favorite riding a nation's best 29-game winning streak. And that's when the Dynasty had one last gasp, because in a fiery 27-24 ball game, it'd be the Tide taking hold of a 10-point third quarter lead, and Georgia tried their hardest to fight back, even cutting the deficit to 20-17. And that's when Jalen Milroe and Alabama let a naysayer know and led the crushing drive in Mercedes-Benz to retake a 10-point lead at 27-17. And Georgia's last punch wouldn't be enough, as they ran out of time, losing their 29-game win streak in a 27-24 loss, and most importantly, missed the playoff. Now, there was still talk that Alabama should miss the playoffs, but let's be serious. The SEC was never going to get left out of the college football playoff, and when was the last time the SEC even missed a BCS national title game, let alone a 14 playoff? So that meant the undefeated ACC champion Florida State Seminoles would become the first ever undefeated conference champion to be left out of the playoff. And Alabama, unlike 2020 in Arlington, Texas, would be headed to Pasadena, California for a date with the Michigan Wolverines in the Rose Bowl game to head to the national championship. And little did anyone know on that beautiful New Year's Day, it'd be the last time we'd see Nick Saban coach a college football game. It was a defensive affair, and possibly the best Rose Bowl any early 2000s college football fan could ask for. The two teams went back and forth, and Alabama led 20-13 with just under 5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. As we all know, this Alabama dynasty was built on defense, and for just 4.5 minutes, if the Crimson Tide could just get one stop, they'd be headed back where they belong, in the national title game. But just like the game earlier in the year versus the team in Burnt Orange, when they needed a stop, the defense couldn't get it done. And JJ McCarthy led a massive drive to tie the Rose Bowl game at 20 apiece with just over a minute to go. And then in overtime, the Michigan offense didn't skip a beat, easily scoring in 2 plays off the back of the nation's #1 running back Blake Corum. And when Alabama had the chance to answer, they got all the way down to 4th and goal at the 3-yard line. 3 yards would decide if Alabama was headed to the national title game or a heart-wrecking defeat. And with the season on the line, Milroe was stopped and stuffed in one of the more heartbreaking endings in Alabama history. And not just the fact that they lost a football game, but that play was the last time Nick Saban would stand on green grass as the head coach of Alabama. Ever since the perfect 2020 national championship season, things hadn't really been the same. They had to scathe by in certain games they normally dominate. They lost their mental chokehold over Georgia, and the moment the dynasty truly started its downfall can be traced back to that Saturday night in Tuscaloosa when Ewers and the Texas Longhorns ended multiple streaks held by the Crimson Tide in a changing of the guard moment. And speaking of a changing of the guard, it'd be Washington's Kalen DeBoer taking over the reins in Tuscaloosa. DeBoer had just took the Huskies to the national title game where, just like Alabama, they'd fall to the Wolverines. And now DeBoer would look to take the Crimson Tide back to the promised land while completing the very difficult job of succeeding Nick Saban. Even though he'd be able to bring his guys in, the losses of Caleb Downs, Isaiah Bond, and even the 5-star Elite 11 MVP Julian Sayin would go on to be pivotal. So how did the DeBoer era start? Well, it'd be one of the most exciting starts to a season in Alabama history. They started an expected 3-0, including a road victory over Wisconsin, but it was September 28th versus Georgia, when in a top 4 showdown, the true freshman sensation Ryan Williams would make a name for himself. This was one of the most hyped games of the entire season, and with all the hype, Alabama stormed out to a 28-0 lead just minutes into the second quarter. But Kirby and the Dogs weren't going down without a fight, and they stormed all the way back to take a stunning 34-33 lead with 2 minutes and 31 seconds to go. So with Alabama's backs against the wall, who else would it be other than Ryan Williams to spin away from 2 defenders and take it 75 yards to reclaim the lead at 41-34. And from one true freshman to another, Xavier Brown would intercept Carson back in the end zone and hand Kalen DeBoer his first ranked win as the Alabama head coach. And you couldn't write a better script than a statement win over what really has become your biggest rival in this decade in Kirby Smart in Georgia. So with everything looking up for the Tide and coming off a stunner over number 2 Georgia, the cracks would immediately start to form in the DeBoer era. Because Diego Pavia, an unranked Vanderbilt, would upset the Crimson Tide 40-35 in what is one of the most shocking losses in Alabama history. Vanderbilt took the opening drive right down the field for a touchdown, then ripped a pick 6 right off Jalen Milroe to take a 13-0 lead. And that basically set the tone, because it was 23-7 before Alabama notched a touchdown to make it 23-14 right before half. After that, the game turned into Alabama-Tennessee from 2 years ago with a massive scoring output. And with Alabama trailing 40-28 with 4 minutes to go, Milroe went to Ryan Williams, who took the 4th down reverse to the end zone, and the score was now 40-35. And with 2 minutes and 45 seconds to go, and Alabama had all 3 timeouts, so just like Texas did last year, Vanderbilt ran it down their throat. And all the time ticked off the clock, leaving the score 40-35, and somehow, someway, Vanderbilt had beaten the Alabama Crimson Tide. Just even a year ago, Vanderbilt even competing with Alabama would have been a shocker, but now defeating Alabama was just something nobody saw coming. And the bad news would get worse. Just a week later, they'd scathed out a 27-25 victory versus South Carolina. And then on the 3rd Saturday in October, Tennessee would hand Alabama their second loss in 3 weeks in a 24-17 defeat at the hands of Nico Iamaleava and Dylan Sampson. Again, it was an offensive struggle as the score was 7-0 favoring Alabama at halftime. Tennessee would finally get on the board with 6 minutes to go in the third quarter as Sampson ran it in from 2 yards out. All of a sudden, this defensive slugfest would turn into a shootout. Alabama put up a field goal, and Tennessee responded with a second Sampson rushing touchdown. Now the Bama pass scheme would get involved, and Jeremy Bernard, who really stepped up as the team's wide receiver 1 over the course of the year, would get them down the field just before Justice Haynes ran it in to retake the lead at 17-14. The fourth quarter would then see these two one-loss teams fight for what could be their season. So with 6 minutes left, Nico Iamaleava threw a fade to the corner of the end zone on a massive third down that would be caught by Brazel, and gave Tennessee the lead right back. And when the Alabama offense had to get going, they faltered down the stretch, and then a very undisciplined penalty flag on Kendrick Law set up a daunting 4th and 22 to keep their chances alive. And of course, the screen would go nowhere. Thankfully, they had all 3 timeouts, and this time they actually did get a stop when needed. And with the score sitting at 24-17, they needed to deliver on a massive touchdown drive. And then on the very first play of the drive, Milroe would be picked off and the game was over. Already, Alabama had their second loss, and for the second time in 3 years, it was a loss to Tennessee. So again, something we weren't used to seeing, and normally this would write an end to your season. But with the all-new 12-team playoff, they were still in it, but it took a perfect season the rest of the way. They got off to the best start possible, a 30-0 shutout win over number 21 Missouri, and then blowing out number 15 LSU in Death Valley at night 42-13. The Tide now set at 8-2 and had a very easy path to the playoff with no ranked teams remaining, but their trip to Norman, Oklahoma would be anything but easy, as with a grand total of 68 passing yards, Jackson Arnold and his Sooners defeated the Tide 24-3 to end Alabama's season, and Alabama quarterback Jalen Milroe threw for 0 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. So now the season was pretty much over, and just to throw some salt in the wound, they'd get sent to the ReliaQuest Bowl, where they'd lose to a 5-loss Michigan team, 19-13, in a torrential downpour. Definitely not the first year on the job you want as the Alabama head coach, but year 2 would get even worse just 3 hours into the season. Because remember that Florida State team who 2 years ago missed a playoff while being an undefeated conference champion, and it was Alabama who took their spot? Well, they were back for vengeance, and Mike Norvell, coming off a 2-win season in 2024, would be looking for that revenge. Everyone knows how bad Florida State was in 2024, finishing with just a 2-10 record, and the way this one started versus Alabama, it seemed like they were en route to another blowout. Bama drove right down the field and took a quick hold of a 7-0 lead. But then Florida State answered right back with a touchdown. Alabama of course would miss a field goal with Connor Talty attempting his first career field goal. Then Florida State took it 32 yards to the house and shockingly took a 14-7 lead. And they weren't done just yet, as they'd get the ball back and tack on a field goal to lead 17-7. And now the rain was pouring, and just like the last time Alabama played in Florida versus Michigan, it shut down their offense for the rest of the half. The second half would start with sunshine and a failed 4th down conversion to put no points on the board. Florida State would immediately answer, and Jalen Lucas took it all the way down to the 8-yard line. So why not take a 24-7 lead over Alabama? And remember, Alabama was a massive 13.5 point favorite, but they now trailed by 17 and needed to get going quick. So they put up a field goal and a touchdown, and the score was 24-17 with 11 minutes to go. It seemed the Seminole dream was too good to be true, but with the momentum slipping away, they went to the trickery to get back in field goal range, and then said forget the field goal and muscled their way through the Alabama defense and finished the drive with a crucial touchdown. A touchdown that proved to be the knockout punch after Ryan Williams had a massive drop, setting up 4th down where Ty Simpson would be stopped 1 yard short of the first down on 4th and 10. And unbelievably, but very believably, at this point in the fall of the Alabama dynasty, Florida State would run out every last second of the 5 minutes and 31 seconds remaining on the clock. And somehow, someway, number 8 Alabama would fall to an unranked Florida State, coming off a season where they had 1 Power 4 win, and to make matters even worse, Florida State would finish the season with just a 2-6 record in ACC play. This was the type of loss that had completely turned the Alabama fanbase against the board, but thanks to the 12-team playoff, their season wasn't over yet. They'd of course go on to beat UL Monroe in Wisconsin, but then that would set up their Week 4 date with number 5 Georgia. And seeing their remaining schedule, this was essentially for the season. And just like old times, Alabama would prevail and take down the Dogs in a 24-21 thriller. Now the Tide had fully bounced back from their loss in Tallahassee, and in a very impressive stretch, they'd avenged their loss to Vandy from last year, besting the 16th ranked Commodores 30-14. Then the next week versus number 14 Missouri, they'd walk away with a 27-14 win. And then in yet another revenge game, they'd beat number 11 Tennessee 37-20. So 4 straight weeks versus top 16 teams and 4 straight victories. Alabama was now 6-1 and ranked number 4 in the country before they'd have yet another wild one versus South Carolina, where they'd win 29-22 after trailing 22-14 with under 3 minutes to go. maybe Kalen DeBoer had found his groove, because after the bye week, it was time for the matchup with LSU. And yes, maybe they've fallen off and fired their head coach Brian Kelly, but it's still LSU Alabama, and the Tide would take care of business with a 20-9 victory. So that would set up a rematch with the Oklahoma Sooners. Last year, it was an unranked Sooner team who bested the Tide 24-3 and ended their season. This year, the Tide's backs were against the wall again as an 11th ranked Oklahoma team would come to town. And oh my goodness, it's happening again. Alabama goes 3 and out, Oklahoma takes the punt return down to the 30, gets 3 on the board. Then Ty Simpson throws a pick right into the hands of Eli Bowen, who returns it 87 yards to the house for a 10-0 lead. But don't worry, Alabama would finally get a touchdown on the board just for John Mateer to turn into Tim Tebow and overpower the entire Alabama defense. And now the two teams were just going back and forth. And with the score 17-14 and 3 seconds before halftime, of course, Alabama would miss a 36-yard field goal wide to the left and go to half trailing by 3. Oklahoma would then follow it up, making a 52-yard field goal coming out the locker rooms. Thankfully, Alabama's offense responded and they'd take a 21-20 lead off a touchdown. Then Oklahoma would make a field goal to take a 23-20 lead 2 minutes into the fourth. Oklahoma was now trying to hold on for yet another improbable upset over Alabama. 5 minutes remained on the game clock. Alabama just needed a field goal to retake the lead. They were driving but also using up a ton of game clock. Then they hit a roadblock. Now with just a minute and a half remaining, they were facing 3rd and 21. Simpson rifled one to Isaiah Horton, which cut off 16 of the yards, but 4th and 6 remained, and Peyton Bowen would break up Simpson's pass attempt, and the Sooners would, for the 2nd year in a row, defeat Alabama, avoid their 2nd loss, and hand Alabama their 2nd loss, which would also be Kalen DeBoer's first home loss as the Alabama head coach. The only test that stood in front of Alabama the rest of the season was the Iron Bowl. You're now 9-2, and you had to win to keep your SEC title and, most importantly, college football playoff hopes alive. And you all know by now exactly what happens in that stadium. Alabama seemed to be on their way to maybe even a shutout, leading 17-0 with 4 minutes left in the 2nd quarter. But the Tigers bounced back, and after multiple field goals and a touchdown, it was 20-13 starting the 4th quarter. And that's when Auburn would start at their own 12, and a few plays later, Daniels would find Simmons, who'd take it 66 yards. And a few plays after that, Jeremiah Cobb would finish the drive, and somehow we were tied at 20 apiece. Alabama would then have to respond, and they did with a 15-play 75-yard drive totaling nearly 8 minutes to take hold of a 27-20 lead. The season now depended on the Alabama defense with just over 3 minutes to go. First, the Tigers would be facing a 4th and 4, and they'd survive thanks to a pass interference. Then came 4th and 2, and Daniels would use his legs to muscle his way to a 1st down. And with under 40 seconds to go, in striking distance at the Alabama 27, the sophomore sensation Cam Coleman would fumble the ball after Bray Hubbard knocked it loose, and Alabama was headed to the SEC title. And yeah, this SEC championship was certainly interesting. It's definitely the least important Georgia-Alabama matchup in the last 10 years thanks to the expanded playoff. And it really seemed as long as Alabama just kept the game competitive, they were locks to go to the playoffs. But that's exactly what didn't happen. First, it was 7-0 Georgia at the end of 1, then 14-0 Georgia at halftime, then 21-0 Georgia at the end of 3. And the final score would go on to be 28-7. The result of this game wasn't in doubt for a single second in the second half, and this was the type of loss that before it was 100% going to end your season. Alabama now had 3 losses, and there were very real shouts that they shouldn't make the playoffs. But going into the SEC championship as the SEC's #1 seed and playing an extra game, the committee decided not to punish them for the loss. So Alabama makes it in as the 9 seed over a 2-loss Notre Dame team. But what should have happened there is still up for debate, as Alabama played a much tougher schedule. and their reward would be number 8 Oklahoma for the right to face number 1 Indiana in Pasadena. Yes, the same Oklahoma team who had defeated them in the last 2 seasons. This game would also be taking place in Norman, and Alabama just seemed to lay down immediately. Right off the gate, it looked exactly like a replay of the SEC championship game. 7-0 Oklahoma, 10-0 Oklahoma, and then 17-0 Oklahoma to start the second quarter. For the second straight week, Alabama has come out unprepared. Midway through the second quarter, Alabama's offense finally found something, even converting a 4th and 2 on the drive for a touchdown. And with Oklahoma having the chance to go up 24-7, a massive drop by Xavier Robinson would dash their chances at extending the lead, and the ensuing punt return would be blocked, and Alabama tacked on 3 more. Now just leading 17-10, Mateer would throw a pick 6 right into the hands of Xavier Brown with just 2 minutes to go before halftime. And somehow, the score was 17-all going into halftime. By this point, Oklahoma was just lifeless. Ty Simpson lofted a pass to Brooks from 30 yards out to take a 24-17 lead. Oklahoma then did absolutely nothing. Alabama tacked on another field goal, and all of a sudden, the Alabama lead was 27-17 on a 27-0 run. Oklahoma started the fourth quarter with their last spark in this game, as Mateer found Deion Burks from 37 yards out to make it 27-24. But Alabama's offense was just firing on all cylinders now, and they'd cap off a 34-7 run with an emphatic touchdown midway through the fourth. And with the season collapsing in front of their eyes, Oklahoma would miss not 1, but 2 field goals to officially put the nail in their coffin in a 34-24 loss. So Kalen DeBoer leads a comeback from down 17 to win his first college football playoff game as the head coach of Alabama, and they exercised some demons in the process. Now the Indiana Hoosiers would await them, a Rose Bowl match that seemed like it was only possible in a video game just a few short years ago. Alabama football, the most dynastic team in college football history, versus the Indiana Hoosiers, who came into the year the losingest team in college football history. Curt Cignetti in just 1 year had took a basketball school to the college football playoff, and now in year 2, he has them the number 1 overall seed and the Big Ten champions after defeating the Ohio State. If you told anyone this just 2 to 3 years ago, no one would believe you. But now it's time to see if the Crimson Tide could knock the Hoosiers back to reality, or if the Hoosiers could fully submit that it's a new era in college football and Alabama isn't to be feared anymore. And well, this one was never close, not even for a single second. This was the Alabama we saw versus Oklahoma last year. This was the Alabama we saw versus Michigan in the bowl game last year. This was the Alabama we saw week 1 in Tallahassee. This was the Alabama we saw versus Oklahoma in the regular season this year. And this was the Alabama we saw in the SEC championship versus Georgia. Alabama losing was no longer a fluke event or a shocking moment. It's just another day now. But even with this being the case, they fell behind and trailed 17-0 at halftime. Yes, the Alabama Crimson Tide were shut out in the first half by the Indiana Hoosiers, and the third quarter would be no better. They fell behind 24-0, Ty Simpson would be pulled, and with Austin Macken under center, they'd notch their only points of the game on a 28-yard field goal. And while the Hoosiers took their foot off the gas pedal, they still won by a dominant margin of 38-3. Just unbelievable. We started the decade with Alabama going undefeated with an all-SEC schedule in 2020 en route to a national championship. And now we meet the halfway point of the decade with Indiana going undefeated at 16-0 and smothering the Alabama Crimson Tide in Pasadena. Of course, we saw things start to slip towards the end of the Saban era, but every loss was a close game and they all had a rarefied shock factor. But under DeBoer, it's kind of expected. The brand of Alabama still makes you want to favor them, but if things go south, you can't say you're surprised anymore. Alabama has now lost control of the SEC, and it'll take a lot of work to grab that title back over Georgia, who they used to torment just a few short years ago. And even other teams like Texas seem to have their number not just on the field, but also in recruiting. Maybe the downfall of Alabama was just the perfect storm of Saban's retirement, NIL evening the playing field, and an expanded playoff alongside the SEC's expansion. But in the end, Alabama is a dynasty no more. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like and comment, and check out this video on the downfall of the thing Alabama used to run, the Bowl Championship Series.